September the 1st, 1939. Dawn. The village of Krajanty in the Polish corridor. Captain Godlewski of the 18th Pomeranian Ulan Regiment sat on his horse watching the fog roll across the fields. He was 29 years old, a career cavalry officer from a family that had served Poland for generations. His men, 87 lancers of the regiment's reconnaissance squadron, waited behind him in column formation. Their horses stamped nervously. The men could hear something in the distance, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Godlewski had received orders an hour earlier. German infantry had been spotted moving through the forest near the village. He was to conduct a reconnaissance in force, determine enemy strength, and report back. Standard cavalry work. The kind of mission Polish cavalry had executed perfectly for centuries. What Godlewski didn't know, what nobody in the Polish High Command yet understood, was that this wasn't a border skirmish. At that very moment, 1.5 million German soldiers were pouring across the Polish frontier. The largest military invasion in human history had begun just hours earlier, and Godlewski's small squadron of horse cavalry was about to ride directly into the path of the German 20th Motorized Division. The story of Polish cavalry charging German tanks has become one of the most enduring myths of World War II. Nazi propaganda turned it into a symbol of Polish backwardness and futility. Brave but foolish cavalrymen with lances attacking modern armored vehicles. The image persists even today, but the truth, as it almost always is far more complex and far more interesting than the myth. The truth reveals courage of a different kind. Not the courage of foolish men making a doomed gesture, but the courage of professional soldiers doing exactly what they were trained to do under impossible circumstances. Let's understand what Polish cavalry actually was in 1939. The Polish army fielded 11 cavalry brigades, roughly 70,000 mounted troops. But these weren't medieval knights charging with lances. They were mounted infantry, highly mobile reconnaissance and raiding forces trained to move quickly on horseback, then dismount to fight as infantry. Every cavalryman carried a modern rifle. Each squadron had machine guns, anti-tank rifles, and light artillery. The horses were transportation, not weapons. Think of them as the pickup trucks of 1939. Fast, mobile, able to move across terrain where vehicles couldn't go. In the forests and swamps of Poland, cavalry made perfect sense. Captain Godlewski understood this perfectly. As his squadron moved through the forest toward Krajanty, they followed standard doctrine. Scouts ahead, main body ready to dismount and take defensive positions at first contact. They weren't expecting to fight mounted. Nobody in the Polish cavalry had fought mounted since the Polish-Soviet War of 1920. That morning in the forest, Godlewski's scouts reported enemy soldiers resting in a clearing. German infantry, perhaps 200 men, no vehicles visible, no heavy weapons. The Germans appeared to be taking a break from their march. They had stacked their rifles. Some were eating, some were sleeping. Godlewski made a tactical decision that any cavalry commander would have made. His squadron had surprise. The enemy was disorganized and unprepared. A mounted charge could scatter them before they could form defensive positions. Once scattered, his men would dismount and engage properly. He gave the order. The squadron formed into line, sabers drawn. The traditional cavalry charge formation that had been used for centuries. Not because anyone thought sabers were effective weapons against modern soldiers, but because a line of horses moving at full gallop is a terrifying psychological weapon. The thunder of hooves, the sight of 80 mounted men bearing down on you. It breaks infantry formations, makes them run. Then you dismount and do the real fighting. The charge worked perfectly. The German infantry panicked. They ran. Godlewski's men cut through them, wheeled around, and were beginning to dismount when everything went catastrophically wrong. German armored cars appeared from the tree line. Nobody had known they were there. The scouting reports had been wrong. The German infantry had been resting after being transported by trucks. The armored cars had been hidden in the forest. They opened fire immediately. Machine guns and 20mm cannons. The horses screamed. Men fell. Godlewski's squadron disintegrated. Those who could broke for the tree line. Those who couldn't died in the field. Captain Godlewski survived. 17 of his men didn't. The rest scattered into the forest and eventually made it back to Polish lines. And here is where the myth was born. Italian war correspondents embedded with the German forces arrived at the scene hours later. They saw the dead horses, the dead cavalrymen with their sabers. The German officers told them that the foolish Poles had charged tanks with cavalry. The correspondents wrote dramatic stories about medieval tactics meeting modern warfare. The Nazi propaganda ministry amplified the story. It was perfect for their purposes. It made the Poles look backward and stupid. It made German victory seem inevitable. The story of the cavalry charge against tanks spread around the world. But here's what actually happened during the September campaign. Polish cavalry fought with extraordinary effectiveness for 18 days before Poland was overwhelmed. Not by charging tanks, by doing exactly what cavalry was supposed to do. Lieutenant Władysław Anders commanded a cavalry squadron in the Volhynian Cavalry Brigade. His diary entries from September 1939 paint a completely different picture than the myth suggests. "We moved fast," he wrote on September 4th. "Faster than the German mechanized units could react. We hit their supply columns, their communication lines. We appeared where they didn't expect cavalry to be. We fought dismounted with rifles and machine guns. We killed German soldiers and destroyed German equipment. Then we mounted up and were gone before their armor could respond. The Podolska Cavalry Brigade, under Colonel Julian Filipowicz, conducted a textbook raid on German positions near Jaworów on September 9th. They moved 60 kilometers in 12 hours, traveling at night through terrain where German vehicles couldn't follow. They attacked at dawn, destroyed a German supply depot, killed or captured over 300 German soldiers, and were gone before German reinforcements arrived. Not a single saber was drawn in the entire operation. The cavalrymen fought as dismounted infantry using modern weapons and modern tactics. The problem wasn't that Polish cavalry was obsolete or that Polish commanders were fools. The problem was mathematics. Germany invaded Poland with 2,850 tanks and 1,500 aircraft. Poland had 880 tanks and 400 aircraft. But more critically, Germany invaded from 3 directions simultaneously: from Germany in the west, from East Prussia in the north, and from occupied Czechoslovakia in the south. The Polish army, strung out along the borders trying to defend everything, was cut to pieces in the first 72 hours. Not because they fought poorly, because they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmaneuvered from the start. Major Henryk Dobrzański, known as Hubal, commanded a cavalry squadron that refused to surrender even after the Polish government fled to Romania. Hubal's squadron continued fighting as partisans through the winter of 1939 and into 1940. His diary and letters, preserved after his death, reveal what happened when Polish cavalry fought intelligently. "We avoid main roads," he wrote in November 1939. "We move through the forests where their tanks can't go. We attack at night, small German outposts, supply convoys. We take their weapons and ammunition. We kill their soldiers. Then we disappear. The Germans send armor after us, entire companies of tanks. They find nothing. You can't fight cavalry with tanks in a forest. You need infantry. And when they send infantry, we're cavalry again. We're somewhere else. Hubal's squadron operated for 8 months behind German lines. They fought over 40 engagements. They killed hundreds of German soldiers. They tied down German forces that were needed elsewhere. Hubal himself was finally killed in April 1940 when German forces surrounded his position. But his squadron demonstrated exactly how effective cavalry could be when properly employed. The myth of the cavalry charge against tanks obscures something more important. It obscures the real tragedy of the September campaign. Not that Poland fought with obsolete tactics, but that Poland fought alone. Britain and France had guaranteed Poland's independence. They had promised to attack Germany if Poland was invaded. They did declare war on September 3rd, but they didn't attack. The French army, the largest in Europe, sat behind the Maginot Line. The British sent no troops to the continent. Poland fought for 18 days, expecting Allied help that never came. Lieutenant Colonel Stefan Rowecki commanded the 13th Vilnius Ulan Regiment during those 18 days. His after-action report, written after he escaped to France, drips with bitterness. "We fought magnificently," he wrote. "My men fought with courage and skill. We conducted reconnaissance. We raided enemy positions. We delayed German advances. We did everything cavalry is supposed to do, and we were overwhelmed not because we were incompetent or backward, but because we were alone. Where were the British? Where were the French? They promised us they would attack. They promised us 15 days. Give us 15 days, they said, and we'll be attacking Germany from the west. We gave them 18 days, and they did nothing. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any propaganda." Polish cavalry losses in September 1939 were proportionally no higher than Polish infantry losses. About 18% of cavalry personnel were killed or wounded, about 20% of infantry. The cavalry performed exactly as well as any other branch of the Polish military. They weren't wiped out because they stupidly charged tanks. They suffered normal combat losses while conducting normal military operations against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. After Poland fell, many cavalry officers escaped and continued fighting. They fought in France in 1940. They fought in North Africa. They fought in Italy. Colonel Stanislaw Maciek commanded the 1st Polish Armored Division in France and later in the liberation of Europe. Maciek had been a cavalry officer in 1939. By 1944, he commanded tanks. His division was one of the most effective Allied armored formations in Western Europe. The man who supposedly came from a backward cavalry army ended up as one of the war's finest tank commanders. When asked after the war about Polish cavalry charging tanks, Maciek would become visibly angry. "It's a lie," he said in a 1967 interview. "A Nazi lie that the world believed because it was dramatic. We never charged tanks. We weren't fools. We were professional soldiers. We fought a modern war with whatever weapons we had. And we fought well. The myth persists because it's simple and dramatic. Medieval warriors charging modern machines, courage overcoming common sense. It's the kind of story that feels true even when it isn't. But the real story is more important. The real story is about a small country that fought desperately for its survival while its allies stood by and watched. About soldiers who did their duty with skill and courage under impossible circumstances. about propaganda that turned tactical competence into strategic foolishness. Captain Godlewski, that young officer who led the charge at Krojanti, survived the war. He escaped to Britain, flew with the Polish Air Force, and after the war settled in London rather than returned to Soviet-occupied Poland. In 1972, a British historian interviewed him about the events of September 1, 1939. Godlewski, then 62 years old, spoke carefully about that morning. "We were cavalry," he said. "We did what cavalry does. We reconnoitered. We engaged enemy infantry. We made a tactical error about enemy strength. It cost men's lives, my men's lives. I've lived with that for 33 years. But we didn't charge tanks. There were no tanks there. The armored cars came later, after the charge. The propaganda made us look like fools. We weren't fools. We were soldiers fighting the best we could with what we had." That's the truth that the myth obscures. Polish cavalry in 1939 fought exactly as modern cavalry should fight. They weren't medieval knights. They were 20th century soldiers. They lost not because they were obsolete, but because they were overwhelmed. The courage they showed wasn't the courage of foolish men making a doomed romantic gesture. It was the courage of competent professionals fighting a losing war because it was their duty. That's a different kind of courage, a harder kind, and it deserves to be remembered accurately.